This is harder than some of the other talks on people to give because I've given quite a bit of my life to studying the writings of this woman rather carefully, pretty much since 1967. So this is someone with whom I'm kind of familiar because I've spent years thinking about some of her ideas or trying to understand some of her ideas. So I'm probably not quite as detached as I am when I'm talking about some other individual to whom I haven't had such a direct connection. I'll just begin by mentioning that, just to get your attention, mentioning that her primary writing, which is a book called The Secret Doctrine, it's about 2 inches thick, and the writing's very small. And there are about 5,000 footnotes, and most of it goes right over my head. But nonetheless, I've studied it. But that book, her main book, and most difficult to read, let alone understand, sat on Einstein's desk in his office for the whole time he had the desk in the office. The only book on his desk was The Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky, and it was apparently well read. I mean, it wasn't a new book. So if you and I don't care for The Secret Doctrine, at least we can know that Einstein did. And I've been told, I haven't seen this with my own eyes, but I've been told that if you go to the library at either Caltech or MIT, that you'll find like 10 or 12 volumes of The Secret Doctrine in their libraries, very well used. And one of her main objectives, Blavatsky's, was to radically alter the course of where science was going in the 19th century. It had gotten to the point in the 19th century that a 19th century physicist actually made the remark, which Blavatsky makes fun of. This physicist actually made the remark that we can't be encouraging people to go into physics anymore because there's nothing more for physics to discover. So they kind of thought they had it together and problems were solved. You don't have to think about physics anymore. Then Einstein read The Secret Doctrine and said that's where he got his relativity theory. So the book's been influential. No Secret Doctrine, no Einstein, no relativity theory. No relativity theory, nothing that's followed from that. So this woman was very odd and eccentric when she was alive. And to the people who've read and understood some of her writings, she's pretty awesome, even now that she's gone. And she used to talk quite a lot about what she called occult history, which is basically just history as it actually was, as opposed to how it's being told. And how it actually was can only be known by sages, because all we have to go on is what's been written down. And what's been written down has been written down by people with a perspective. So the claim is that the real history of the human race exists, and that's actually known by wise beings. Whereas our conceptions of history are pretty much imposed upon us by whatever history courses we happen to run into along our way. Or if we didn't hit any history courses, whatever somebody told us it was along the way. And basically, historians have a fairly, from Blavatsky's standpoint, they have a very foreshortened view of history, human history. She takes it back 18 million years. Historians take it back about 10,000 and say that's when it started. So there are a few discrepancies in between what this woman said and what most people think is happening, which is why she said that most people will make fun of her book because the discrepancy is too big between what she's claiming and my comfortable little world, where history started 6,000 years ago and blah, blah, blah. Plus, on top of that, I'll probably have a trip going, whether I believe it or not, because as always, we have believers and disbelievers on every question. But we also have, in addition to what I just mentioned, we have quote-unquote scientific evidence of something called evolution. The claim being that somehow gorillas turned into us. And that's kind of their explanation. It's just an evolutionary thing, and it's linear. And at some point, human beings emerged. And she doesn't give that one she gives that one pretty short thrift too. Darwinism. She wrote whole books and pamphlets showing how the assumptions of science in her day were just factually incorrect. And therefore, their conclusions were had left a lot to be desired. Yeah. So this woman was born in 1831 in the Ukraine, and she had aristocratic parents on both sides, Russian and German. And she was born on midnight on August 10-11, 1831, born at midnight. And the peasants, because they had peasants on these estates in Russia then, when the peasants heard when she was born, they said, this woman's going to have a very unusual life. It was August 11-12, midnight, 1831. So the peasants picked up on the date time and thought this was a very unusual being. The educated ones, of course, thought the peasants were just foolish, as usually is the case. And then at her christening, because her parents were somewhat orthodox, at her christening, as she was being christened, the robes of the priest who was conducting the ceremony caught on fire. And this led people to believe that she'd have a difficult life. Which she did. Yeah. So she, as early as she can remember, kind of like as early as you and I can remember. Well, as early as she could remember, the only thing she'd been really interested in was universal brotherhood. No one had told her about it. Her parents certainly weren't into it, being aristocrats. So she grows up with this idea of universal brotherhood in her head. And she also has in her head 3 questions. She's a little girl. She also has in her head 3 questions, or 2 questions. The first one is who, where, and what is God? Who, where, and what is God? She didn't make these questions up, they just came into her head as needing to be answered by her. So like who, where, and what is God? That's the question that got laid on her when she was about 19. And the other question that got laid on her, came into her head and said, you need to answer this. The other one was, who is it who can show the immortality of the soul so that we know it's a truth? Who is it that can show the immortality of the soul so that we know it's the truth? So those are the 2 questions she was seeking to answer. And they were so important to her that she didn't do anything but whatever it took to answer those questions. So ordinary life, the life of the aristocrat, conventional life, conventional thinking, they weren't for her from the earliest age. She came in beyond all of our little concepts and categories. So she didn't have to work her way through them to find out there was nothing there. She came in with those 2 questions. And that's all she was about. Who, where, what is God? And who can show the immortal spirit of man to see, so we see that it's immortal. So she self-educated herself. Oh, by the way, I just want to mention, if you're interested in this lady, you want to go further, she's all over the internet. So everything she's written is on the internet. So it's not, it's still going on. So anyway, she pretty much self-educated herself, I imagine with tutors and stuff, until she was 18. And then she started her travels. Now this is probably 1838 by now. So in 1838 she's in the Ukraine and she begins her travels. Looking, what's she traveling for? To find someone who has the answer to these questions. Because no one around the place had them. So she had to go find, somebody must. That was her trip. Somebody must have these answers. She didn't want them out of a book. She wanted to meet a person who could give her these answers. So she started traveling extensively. She traveled, just to name some of the countries, Germany, France, Egypt, Athens, Cairo, Alexandria. She traveled all these places, all by herself, usually dressed as a man. Because it's 1838 and women don't travel alone. So she did all this traveling, and going back again to when she was a little girl, when she was a little girl, she'd have these dreams, and there'd be this man in her dreams. And he'd be tall, and he'd have kind of a white, not robe exactly, but a white garment on, and a turban. And his eyes were, she'd never seen eyes like them. But this was just a dream. But this was a recurring dream through her childhood, this man, and she got the impression in her childhood that he had been there to help her when she was going through certain crises. She got she came to have the opinion that she'd had help going through some of these crises. And I'm just reporting her opinion. And eventually she ended up in London on her travels, kind of passing through, but she'd stay a while in different cities. And she was in London in 1851, which would make her 20 years old. And she's already done all this traveling, and she's 20. And she's walking through Hyde Park in London. And the man she's dreamed about since she was a little girl is walking towards her in Hyde Park. So that's how they met on the physical plane. And he proceeded to tell her, and all of this is documented, if you're into documentation. He proceeded to tell her that he was a member of something called it's been given different names, but he called it the Lodge of the Mahatmas. A Mahatma is a great being. That's what the word literally means. And Gandhi wasn't one, as I've mentioned from here before. And Gandhi was totally chagrined when people started calling him Mahatma Gandhi, because he knew that was a very sacred word, and he claimed he'd never even met such a being. But he believed he knew they exist, but he never even met one, so he didn't want to suddenly be being called one. It's like, but he knew they existed. Sometimes they're called the Brotherhood of Bodhisattvas. It's basically, the concept is that there are fully enlightened beings in the earth, on the earth, in bodies. Yeah, fully enlightened beings on the earth, in bodies, and they're a brotherhood, which doesn't exclude women. They're a brotherhood, and they all interact with each other, so to speak. And they exist only this is all from Blavatsky, they exist only to aid humanity. That's the only reason they exist. You get a lot of these same themes in certain kinds of Buddhism and other religions. Anyway, she met this man in Hyde Park in 1851, and she immediately knew somehow that he was a Mahatma, and she didn't have to be told, in other words. And she said, well, I finally meet you. What am I to do? So he told her to travel to certain places. He gave her kind of a travel itinerary. And he said, after you have traveled these places, I will meet you in India, and from there we'll go to Tibet. And then you'll spend a number of years training in Tibet. That's what he told her in Hyde Park. It was not a long conversation. It was just about what I've just said. And she said, she didn't say this, but the message was, you got it. You got it. I'll start traveling tomorrow. And she did, you know, she just did the travels. All the travels involved going to cities in which there was some version or another of the mystery schools. So she wasn't just merely covering land. She was stopping at virtually every mystery school that still existed and learning whatever they had to teach her. Because they all teach different things, different schools. So the way that she was given to get to her teacher in India took her through these mystery schools, and she mastered what each one of them had to teach. So by the time she got to him again in India, she was much further along than she'd been when she met him in Hyde Park. So she went to Tibet with him. And all we know is that she studied there, and she studied with fully enlightened beings in human bodies, of whom the world doesn't know, until Blavatsky mentioned them in the 19th century. They hadn't been mentioned in almost 2,000 years in the West. The church took care of that. And so I think I'm going to go back now a little bit. We were talking about history being a lot longer than most historians think it was, and older, and the various vicissitudes and evolutions of humanity go way back too, and we've all been through a lot more than we think we have. Not good or bad, just more. And we're all here as a product of what we've already done. So there's no one to point the finger at but oneself. No wonder people didn't like Blavatsky. She talked this way. So anyway, she said, well, you don't have to understand, you know, the universal scope of human history, because only sages and seers can actually see that. So you don't have to don't worry about understanding that, because you won't. And it's not in history books either, so just kind of remain agnostic. Like, who knows what's going on? And she says, but it might do you some good to think about the last 7 centuries, which has led, she said, to me being here. Yeah, and it will lead to one more person being here in 100 years. So she starts talking about the 14th century, and in the 14th century, this Buddhist monk, who the Buddhist traditions say was himself totally enlightened. This Buddhist monk named Tsong Kapa, it's, some of you actually write this stuff down, it's Tsong, then Kapa, so Tsong Kapa. So in the 14th century, Tsong Kapa did a number of things. He reformed the teachings and the practices of Buddhism. This isn't a history lesson, but we're going somewhere. So he kind of reformed some of the teachings and the practices of Buddhism in the East, and he started a tradition which is now known as the Dalai Lama tradition. He started a tradition in which one being would volunteer to be something called the Dalai Lama for 7 centuries. Needed a volunteer for that one, Tsong Kapa did. And he got a volunteer, and the volunteer is currently known as the Dalai Lama. And if you read about that tradition, which is not what we're talking about tonight, you'll find out that they assume in Tibet that the Dalai Lama born is the same one as the Dalai Lama who just died. 700 years of it. One being said, I'll do it. That's quite a sacrifice. I'll do it. Yeah. And then he gets interviewed, and he repeatedly says things like, I'm just a humble monk. Because that's really what he'd rather be doing. But he said he'd do this. But only for 7 centuries. And this is the 7th. So Tsong Kapa started that tradition, the Dalai Lama tradition, in the 14th century. And he also, in the 14th century, started another cycle. He said, for 7 centuries, some one of us will go to the West in the last 25 years of each century. And we'll do that for 7 centuries. And again, we don't have time for detail, but if you're interested, if it started in the 14th century and ended in the 20th, and they're sending some person each century in the last 25 years, well, who were these people? If you're interested in that material is available. It's just recorded history. It's just identifying the person or persons who are the ones who'd been sent. So Blavatsky points to at least this much history, 700 years, and says that meant there are going to be 7 people that come to the West who are going to try to bring some true spirituality and loving kindness to the West. Yeah.
Can you give us the 7 names?
I can't. I've forgotten. I can give you the names of the ones who preceded Blavatsky. And if you look them up, read about any one of them, they're all still called charlatans. And we'll get to that in a few moments also. But in the 18th century, it was a man named Cagliostro, who's on the internet, Cagliostro. And another man named Mesmer. You may have heard of him, mesmerism, which degraded into hypnotism. So Mesmer, and then a man called St. Saint-Germain, Germain. A lot of people have heard about him, and there's a lot of really mistaken stuff about him on the internet. But the name prevails and continues to mystify people who look into it. So anyway, those were the 3 for the 18th century. They sent 3. And all 3 of those were involved with people like Mozart and Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine. They were all involved in quote-unquote secret societies, a lot of them in Paris, where these 3 people would come, and then people from those regions who were ready would also come, and they'd do things like in one meeting in Paris, Benjamin Franklin met a man named Tom Paine, and he said, you need to go to America and start writing so they can have their revolution. And Tom Paine came to America and he wrote 3 books and the revolution happened. And for years historians said there's no connection, but within the last 20 years they all say there was. No Tom Paine, no American Revolution. And why Tom Paine? Because Franklin met him in a meeting of a secret society in Paris and told him to go to America and do it. So this is kind of the level of functioning that Blavatsky's on, and minimally. And so she claimed to be the sixth of the seven that are going to happen in 7th century. She says, I'm the sixth. And my duty is to, since we have more literate people now in the 19th century, my duty is to write down the true teachings in a manner that challenges the assumption of science and religion, and in a manner that's accessible to the serious student, and in a manner that will continue into the future. So that's how she saw what her task was, the writing. And she wrote a lot, and it has continued into the future. So where is I going from there? Yeah, she said right at the beginning, she went to, she did all this traveling, went to Tibet, studied there, went through some kind of illness that literally almost killed her. And she came out of that, quote, with all her powers intact. Quote, with all her powers intact, whatever that means. But she came out of that near-death experience with all her powers intact. And she was probably, wasn't 30 yet. And having met these exalted beings in whom most of humanity don't believe, or if they do believe in them, they've made gods out of them, which they aren't. They're human beings just like us, at least in form. So she was the seventh one, and she was a servant of these Mahatmas, she said. She'd met the first one in Hyde Park. And she said, I'm their servant, and whatever they need me to do to spread their teachings, I'll do. And whatever they want me to write, I'll write. Just tell me what to do. What do you need done? You know, if you're overlooking, quote, poor orphan humanity, and you're trying to help it, and you're using me as part of your way to help it, what do you want me to write? What do you want me to do, you know? Good question. So she was in India at this time when she asked this question. And the man said, move to New York. No explanation, just move to New York. And she was nearly penniless at the time, but she got to New York, settled in, made some money doing things like making paper flowers and selling them on the street. This is somebody who's already spent 3 years studying with beings Gandhi had never even met. And she's selling a few paper flowers on the street just so she can eat, living very simply. And she doesn't know why she's in New York. She just knows she was told to go there. And so there she is, waiting. And she hears about this place called the Eddy Farm. The Eddy Farm, it's in Vermont. She actually reads about it in the paper. And at the Eddy Farm, something called the Eddy Farm in Vermont, there are all these spiritual phenomena apparently occurring at this Eddy Farm. And the people who are interested in such things gather there, and then these strange phenomena happen. So she read about that. And so she cruised on over to Eddy's farm. And she had just observed. And what she observed was occurring. Various kinds of psychic phenomena, but visible to everybody in the room, were occurring. And so she kind of, she didn't validate what they were doing, but she did tell them that what they were doing was real, but she didn't validate it. And later on, not too long later on, but later on she was to validate all the phenomena people were becoming aware of and totally rip apart their explanation of what it was. Just shredded it. They have no idea what it is. They know it's there because some of them are seeing it, but it's not what they think it is. So it ended up, covering the space of time in 2 minutes, it ended up down the line that the so-called spiritualists, which at that time were just numerous, it could be kind of like the Christian coalition today or something, but not in terms of what they thought, but in terms of a lot of them. So there are a lot of people interested in phenomena. And Blavatsky said part of the reason for this is because even though the Mahatmas have done what they can in human history when they can, the 19th century is turning into a hellhole, said Blavatsky. Because with this Industrial Revolution thing happening, all of a sudden you have people who own the means of production, the factories and all that, and they're producing some product that requires labor, and they're trying to get that labor as cheap as they can, which is why they're using children to work 12-hour days in some factory, so some guy up at the top can get his profit. So Blavatsky pointed out that wasn't exactly an ideal set of conditions that was occurring. And she said also that the time and this seeking for different kind of phenomena would bring out forces out of the invisible planes that probably should be left where they are. And she said in the same time the greed in the human spirit and selfishness were allowed to just blossom because you had unfettered capitalism, and where better for a greedy person to go. Hey, laissez-faire, you tell me? I can rip these people off for millions and have some kids cutting cocoa things over in Africa. Cool. Still goes on, by the way. 8, 9, 10-year-olds in the fields in Africa working 16-hour days, opening up cocoa pods. None of them have tasted chocolate. Yeah, but that's a side point. So she says she's the 19th century person, and she's in New York. She's not sure why, and she gets this, and she doesn't describe this, so I can't either. But she could tell when one of these teachers was communicating with her inside her head. And she says at one point, most of these are not real important ideas, but she says at one point, if you have things in your head that are telling you things, one of the first things you have to do is to identify them and where they're coming from, and therefore know what to do with them. So she had one that she had identified with her teacher. So she's sitting in New York, and while she was in New York, and she hadn't even been there very long apparently, she just had tons of visitors coming to where she lived. All kinds of people, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Just wanted to talk to her, wanted to be around her, wanted to meet her. How they knew she was there, but man, they came in droves. And so she was busy that way. But she was still kind of wondering why she was in New York. Certainly not just to talk to people who dropped by. So she gets a message from her teacher in her head that says, and it's in July of 1875, she gets this message that tells her to start a society in New York, which will have as its first object the seeking of universal brotherhood. So she's just been instructed to start a society. And then she gets a further instruction that says, have a man named Alcott be president of the society, and you can be corresponding secretary yourself, Blavatsky. And there's this man called Judge, William Kwan Judge, who will make him the lawyer, because he is a lawyer. And this William Kwan Judge, who was one of her closest disciples, she'd gone to this Eddy household to check out this phenomena and stuff, and she met this guy named Alcott there. So then down the line a little bit, she says to Alcott, there's a guy named William Kwan Judge, and he's an attorney here in New York, and I'd like you to bring him to the next time we go out to the Eddy farm. So he brings Judge, and as instructed. I mean, how does she even know this guy? I mean, just like a name out of the air or something. But Alcott brings him, and Judge meets Blavatsky's eyes. And Judge wrote a long paragraph about that first eye-to-eye contact with Blavatsky. The bottom line of which is that they recognized each other. He realized he was just taking up from where he left off. And what are the orders? What do you want me to do? So Judge ended up doing a lot, but we're not talking about him. So she started something, they ended up calling it the Theosophical Society. And there are a number of those around here and elsewhere. And I need to tell you that none of those have the least thing to do with Blavatsky, even though they all study her writings. But they're not what she started. She said at the end of her life, her dying words allegedly were, do not let my last incarnation be a failure. Do not let my last incarnation be a failure. So she started this Theosophical Society in New York that had as its objects the promulgation of a universal brotherhood and the study of the hidden forces in nature and in man, and study of the various worlds, literatures, philosophies, and religions. Those are the three objects of this society. And she said the first object was the most important one, the one pertaining to universal brotherhood, which she said already exists, but that people don't know it. So that, which is an interesting thing to ponder. So she started this thing, and as she started it, she told the people around her that there'll be two forces working against us. One will be organized religion, which won't like us because we're showing the inadequacies of their positions, as well as showing where they got everything they have, and that wasn't original with them because we can show exactly where they got it from which older traditions. So they're not going to like us because we're going to be telling them that there's nothing new in what you're saying. You took it from other places. But that's how history works. But let's not be pretending it's new, she told them. And in science, so they're not going to like her, she said. They're not going to like this, what we're teaching. And science won't like it either because it's going to be questioning all the basic assumptions of science. So she predicted this before she really got started. And she says the form of the, and she's talking about science and religion, she says the form the punishment takes, which he says we're going to have because we're challenging everything all these institutions think. The form the punishment is going to take will not be burned at the stake like it was during the Inquisition. She said it will be public slander. Public slander, which is precisely what occurred, of course. And, she also attacked the idea, and most theologians of her day, that that there's no kind of intelligence or mind at work in nature, because most organized religions then and now don't have a lot to say about nature. They certainly, you don't hear them going around talking about that it has some kind of intelligence within it. So she tried to bring that idea back in. And basically what she said she was attempting to do is give out as much of the teachings as was appropriate for the 19th century. And as I said, in a manner that can be understood by the sincere student. Although a lot of it, as I said, goes over my head. And create a society which can have people who come to know these teachings and then carry it on. And she did both those things. And she created this society called the Theosophical Society with these objects. It was real small at first, they'd have a meeting, a few people would come. And within a very short time, they had more people coming in than they had room for. And this was in New York. And she wrote a lot of articles about spiritualism because that's what was kind of happening. And as I said, she validated their phenomena and invalidated their explanations. And her explanations she offered for such things were always much deeper and kind of harder to get at because they're like behind the phenomena. Like, okay, what are these the effect of? Well, she knew. She also had, just generally here, she had mastered all the forces in nature and in man. And I'm waiting out the horn, but I don't think it's going to stop.
I have one question for you.
Yeah.
Where did the scriptures that they get this idea when Galileo and Bruno was burned at the stake that the earth was the center of the universe?
Yeah.
At one time it was part of the scriptures. What happened at that time? Was it really in the scriptures or was it something that they...
Yeah, well, it was a church teaching, yeah. And Galileo discovered that the sun's at the center, not the earth, and he was given the option of apologizing or being burned at the stake, and he apologized and said, "I'm sorry, I must have been mistaken." And there's another man at the same time called Bruno, B-R-U-N-O, that's not in the history books, although Galileo is. The one we burned made the history books, or didn't burn made the history books. But Bruno discovered the same thing at the same time, that the sun's the center of the solar system. And they gave him the choice of apologizing or burning, and he chose to burn. And as he was burning, he said, "Let this fire start a fire that will never be put out." Pretty strong stuff. Yeah.
Where in the scripture was it?
I have no idea. I don't know if it is in the scriptures, but I know it was part of the church's teaching. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been so head up over Galileo. Okay, so she started this Theosophical Society, and gradually it got quite large. And she kind of put this man Judge, William Conn Judge, in charge of it in America. And by then it had law just kind of spread around pretty well, quite a few of them, and quite a few people thinking they're taking it seriously. And then she left for India, having started the Theosophical Society here on November 18th, 1975. November 18th in India considered to be Krishna's birthday. So then she went to India and started it there, and same kinds of resistance, but she started it there. And unlike in America, in India she attracted some actual pupils of some of these masters who showed up wanting to help. What can we do to help you? And that got her attention. So they've actually sent some help, so how can we help you? A couple of those showed up. They're both Indian, East Indian. And then she said a lot of jealous and backbiting folks showed up too, all proclaiming an interest in what she was doing. But she recognized the two real ones right away. And both of them, each of them contributed quite a bit just in terms of writing various kinds of articles for her, or on subjects she asked them to write on. One was a very metaphysical thinker, and the other one was more articles just for anyone to read. Anyone could read them. You didn't have to get metaphysical. And one of these fellows, these two fellows, was named Damodar, and he was dying of tuberculosis, and so he stayed for about 3 years, just in spite of his ill health, which caused him to have to rest quite a lot. And he stayed for 3 years and wrote what she asked him to write. He wrote some incredible letters to this Mr. Judge who was still in America. So there's a book of their letters back and forth, which is pretty trippy reading, because it's like two fairly advanced pupils of one teacher talking to each other. So it's really interesting reading. And then after 3 or 4 years, Damodar, quote unquote, walked off into the Himalayas. And no one ever saw him again. And so she starts publishing a magazine in India called The Theosophist. And it's a monthly magazine. And in there, she just gave her views on almost anything you could think about. Science, philosophy, religion, the constitution of man, the psychology of the mind, you name it. Astrology, astronomy, numerology. It just went on, all these articles. And while she was in India, she was often approached by people that wanted to see her perform some kind of psychic phenomena, because she could do that at will. And she pointed out that's a very low level of functioning, producing psychic phenomena. It's basically discouraged. But she did it so that she could gain some credibility with those people on that Eddy farm. Because if you can do that, then we'll listen to what you might have to say. That's how it works, You have to show a little something. So anyway, she was in India. Various people would show up, and she'd meet with them. And one day, this couple showed up and expressed extreme, deep, sincere interest in the truth, capital T, and would she be their teacher and stuff. And she said, sure. And she had another little cottage on the property she was living, so said, you can live there in the cottage. So these people were with her for about 1.5 years. I mean, there were a bunch of other people around, but these people, including these people. And what she didn't know was that the husband of this couple was a carpenter. And what she didn't know was that when she was away, he was going into her house and building all these secret panels in her house. And the reason he was building all these secret panels in her house that she didn't have a clue about is because he was going to use the existence of those secret panels later on to prove that the phenomena she produced were fraudulent, that they're using these secret channels and stuff to make people appear. And so these people rearranged her house with the panels, and shortly thereafter made public the existence of these panels in a newspaper, and that all the stuff that people say about her powers and stuff is just hooky because it's all setup. So then this group called the, why they call them this, I couldn't tell you, why they call themselves this, but a group called the Society for Psychical Research. Society for Psychical Research, and they're in England. So they get, this couple contacts them and say, we got a real fraud thing going on here with psychic research, and you're the Society of Psychic Research, so you should come and check out what's going on down here and tell us what you think. So they cruise out there from England, these couple guys from the Society for Psychic Research, and they check it all out, and they talk to Blavatsky, and they see the hidden passageways and all this. And they conclude that the whole thing's a fraud. Yeah. Now she's already told people about 7 years prior to this that once we get going, we're going to be slandered. So here it is, it's starting. Yeah, so the whole thing's a fraud. It creates a big uproar. And even people close to her start getting kind of iffy. Like the ones who are just totally devoted to her and just, what can I do to help? You know, some of them are kind of getting a little bit ambiguous because of this so-called Hodgins report that said it was all fraudulent. So it stirred things up quite a bit. And if you're ever around a real teacher, we're not going to be, because they're few and far between. And they're never in the newspapers, or the reporter, or the Ojai voice, or the Ojai spirit. They're never in any of them. And they leave that to a different function. So anyway, being around a real teacher like Blavatsky turns up the heat quite a bit within everybody, which they may or may not consciously be aware of. But when something like this comes up, you know, everything just kind of goes into a dithy. And everyone has their view on it, and some are upset, and some aren't, and they're all talking, and it's all like nothing. And the whole thing's nothing. It's just some foolish people that tried to malign Blavatsky and succeeded, according to the Center for Studies of Psychic Research. Nothing to her. Because it was pointed out by her parents that she was absolutely fearless from the very beginning, physically and mentally. She didn't give a goddamn about public opinion. She didn't give a hoot about the so-called certainties of science, let alone the absolute truths of organized religion. Couldn't care less. She's totally eccentric. She had a little thing around her neck with a bag hanging off the end of it, and every once in a while she'd reach into that bag and pull out some tobacco and roll herself a cigarette and smoke it. And while she was meeting with a bunch of people, and most of them, of course, were very shocked, not just because women don't smoke, but because, quote, spiritual people don't smoke. So how could she be spiritual? She's smoking. And she also ate meat, and a lot of these people that got into, quote, theosophy started thinking they ought to be vegetarians, so they're these rabid vegetarians. When she was still alive, they're these rabid vegetarians, you know, they bite you if you ate meat. And it's just going on and on. And like, instead of, the society has been founded to further universal brotherhood. That's its first object. And here are all these people being rabid vegetarians. They've reduced it down to that. Yeah, I'm spiritual. I don't eat meat. And it was just like they'd forgotten everything that was supposed to be happening. So relative to vegetarianism, Blavatsky writes in one of her books, if vegetarianism were the answer, think of how wise cows must be. Yeah, so go ahead, you know, be a vegetarian, but it's got nothing to do with how spiritual you are. You don't believe it? Check out Hitler's eating habits. Total vegetarian. So neither here nor there, you know. But she was very eccentric and iconoclastic, and some of her articles just totally horrified and shocked the status quo. She said it, she didn't say it quite this way, but she said, "I haven't come here for the status quo. And I haven't come here for the scientists because they already have the answers. Or even if they don't, they won't want mine. Because mine are going to involve," she says, 7 planes of reality. The least of which is the one we live on. So if you want to know real science, there is a science you can study, and you'll have to come to understand 7 planes of reality existentially, not just be able to name them off because you read them in a book. You have to actually be able to experience them at will, and then maybe I'll take you on as a pupil. But if you're talking about 7 planes of reality, quote unquote, behind this one, that the 5 senses one, it was clearly the case that the science of her day wasn't explaining this with 7 levels of explanation. There's just one. It's all pretty simple. It's just a bunch of atoms moving around and forming into objects. That's as far as they took it. She took it way further in the Secret Doctrine, all the way to pure light. So what's all this a manifestation of? If you took it all the way back to where all this is coming from, where would you end up if you went all the way back? Pure light. And it's a continuum from pure light to this. And she said a lot of her teachings were about helping people find that clear light within themselves, because it is there, and thereby being able to see it in others. And to the degree that started to occur, which she didn't think it would anytime soon, but she was planting seeds. To the degree that started to occur, people seeing the light in themselves and others, to that degree there'd be less and less conflict. Because there's really nothing to have a conflict over once you're in the light. But if you're not in the light, then there's a lot of stuff to have conflicts over, because there are all these shadows. A lot of them don't get along with each other too good. Yeah, so, you know. She also was very, very critical of something you might recognize from the evening news. She was also very, very critical of the destiny of countries being determined by the people who have the most money. She was very much against that. She said that's what started to happen since the Industrial Revolution, and she says it's only going to get worse. So what she's teaching, she's saying, is up against a lot of stuff, you know, and inconsistent with most of the stuff it's up against. And so it's not going to have an easy time. So she said that her job was to put certain things in print, which she did in a big way. You know, as I said, everything she wrote's on the internet. So she got it all in print. Maybe take on a handful of personal disciples and help them start moving toward the Mahatmas. And when she's done, leave. So she left India shortly after that whole thing about the hidden panels, because it just wasn't worth dealing with, because it was all like, it's just what it accomplished what the people doing it intended it to accomplish. It just kind of focused all the attention away from what she was really teaching onto the hidden panels, and were they there, weren't they there, is she real, isn't she real? All the attention went there. So it worked. And if you want to think about that one, then you got to think about beings who don't want things like Blavatsky's doing to work. So they can come up with any number of ways to make it appear to be something other than it is. In this case, a fraud. So it's the spiritual world isn't really what people think it is. Not the real one that involves human history. You know, it's not going up in Ojai and smiling all the time. You know, or walking around in some kind of blissful, blurred out phase. You know, the real trip is the spiritual life's just as real as what we normally call the non-spiritual one, except there isn't a non-spiritual one. So she said there's no distinction between the spiritual and the unspiritual. It's all light. Or as one book says, it's either everything is God or nothing is God. Right. And it all is, says Blavatsky. But because of all the distractions that we have now, and all the suffering we have, she's talking 19th century, and all the suffering we have in the lower classes, in the greed in the upper classes, there isn't any room for the white dove of truth to land, because no one's looking. But she found a few people who were looking in India, the ones I mentioned who showed up to help her. But after this scandal, she went to London, where she started another started a center there, same name, Theosophical Society, same idea, you know, everything's the same, objects and stuff. And by now she's kind of world famous, so she's got all kinds of visitors. And so she's in London, starts this thing, and one of the things she said she wanted to do before she died was not only to get this thing going, and it wasn't so much the number, the people she was after is that get the ideas out there and get the stuff in print. That will be enough if that's all that can happen. And but one of the other things she said she wanted to do or was supposed to do was to collect around her some students who would be capable of understanding the deeper aspects of things as taught by these teachers, and who could carry those things forward into future years, that knowledge forward into future years. So she did that. She selected a group of people that she took directly on as their teacher. And in 1888, she started this Theosophical Society in New York in 1875. Then she went to India, then to England. 1888, having decided to get a group of people together to get a little more into it than her books, her published books, they founded something called the esoteric section. Esoteric section. Esoteric means hidden section. So within the Theosophical Society, she formed a so-called esoteric section. And that was for people that she took seriously as perhaps having what it took to become an accepted student of one of these Mahatmas. So it wasn't open admittance. She had to ask you, and when she's living, she had to ask you. You didn't ask her. That's poor form. If you had asked her, she'd probably said, "Not yet. Not until you stop asking." Yeah. So anyway, she formed a group of people in this esoteric section, and this man, Judge, still in America, she said, "I need you to write up a pamphlet for this esoteric section that shows that lays out for the person who claims they're interested. I want you to write a pamphlet so that these people who say they're interested in joining the esoteric section, they get this pamphlet if they express any interest. And it kind of lays out what they're in for if they join it. So they can know ahead of time whether they want to join it. They just tell them what it is. Tell them what it is. And then it's up to them. If they don't join, that's fine. If they do join, that's fine." So Judge wrote this thing also online called the Preliminary Memorandum. Preliminary Memorandum So we'd never see this if we hadn't, back then, if Blavatsky hadn't asked us if we wanted to be in the esoteric section. And if we said yes, she'd hand us this preliminary memorandum and say, read over this, take as long as you want, literally as long as you want, years if you want to. Read over this, and if you're interested, after you've read over it and thought about it, don't just read it, then come back and tell me you're interested. And the very first page of this thing, if you open it up, it just says preliminary memorandum on the outside. You just open it up, and the very first page you see, there's these all caps, all black letters that spell the word warning. Warning. Very first thing you see, great big warning. And that's, I can't quote it, but basically it says there's a law in what they call occultism. There's a law in occultism that if anybody expresses his or her desire to move toward real teachers or real teaching, and they've reached the what you might call the public level. I mean, they've done what they can out here. They learn what there is to learn out here. And if they desire to learn more, they can do so. They're looking at this pamphlet. Yeah, you can do this, but you have to take these 7 pledges, and it lists them. And it tells you, right after it lists them, it tells you to take a long time thinking about them. And then it says, because if you take them, they're binding for life and for lives. Life and for lives. So you don't want to jump into them like impulsively. So if you don't think you're up to what those 7 things are about, I mean, they're nice ideas, but you're not quite ready to actually try to do it, that's cool. But if you say you want to try to do it and you sign this thing underneath the pledges where you can sign your name, your full name, if you sign that thing and give it back to her, Blavatsky, then you'll go to the next meeting of the esoteric section, because you're in it now. And she says in that warning part that if a person signs these pledges, then the pledges aren't to Blavatsky. The pledges are to one's own higher self. Yeah. So all the pledges have their wording, and then at the end it says, to my higher self. So that's who you're taking the pledge to. You're taking it to your own higher self, not to some guru somewhere, including Blavatsky. So it's between you and your higher self, the whole trip you just entered into. You've just claimed you want to pursue the inner life between you and your higher self. And you've been warned. Yeah, you read the warning. And one thing she says underneath that warning part, she says that there's kind of a law in again, occultism. It just means knowledge of forces and laws that are invisible to us, but nonetheless present, as science has shown quite a bit of. Most of what science teaches us is invisible, but we believe them, electricity, magnetism, all that. So she's just saying there's more that's invisible. But one of the laws of this invisible realm is that if someone takes these pledges, then depending upon the degree of their seriousness, in the depth of their motivation, certain phenomena will occur. Maybe now, maybe later. Nothing said about that. Just that it will occur. And she does say elsewhere that in some cases it might be a couple years before it starts occurring. In other cases it might almost be immediate. It all depends upon the karma of the person. But the effect she says it will occur is that she gives it a name. She gives these 7 things that you are supposed to think about. She calls those pledges, 7 pledges. So she says, if you take these this manifestation will occur, which she called pledge fever. Pledge fever. And that's when things that you didn't know about yourself, or things you thought you knew about yourself before, or things you weren't aware of about yourself, or things that you're hiding from yourself and didn't even know you're hiding them from yourself, all those things will start to come into your consciousness, and you'll have to deal with them. So in other words, and you're told this before you take these pledges. You don't got to go this way. But if you do take them, it's going to be a hard road. Because you're going to have to face yourself. And not many people want to do that. I mean, they might go to a little weekend retreat, facing yourself, 101. But we're just talking about facing oneself without any blinders on. So we're not missing whole chunks of it because of our blinders. No, just facing the whole trip, man. And she talks about how if you take these pledges, and this is, if this all sounds like nonsense to you, her views, she's already covered you by saying that all this will sound like nonsense to most people. Because it kind of goes outside their box. Anything outside the box is kind of scary. So part of what she says as well is that you take these pledges, then she talks about this light, kind of like a searchlight. And this light's going to come into your being and illuminate every corner. Illuminate every corner. In other words, you're going to become completely conscious of your unconscious. And it's going to be a battle, she says. That battle is depicted in the Bhagavad Gita. Buddha talks about it. No great teacher says that real spiritual knowledge is easy to get. Because it isn't. That's like telling some little kid that it's easy to become a piano virtuoso who wants to play the piano. Well, you can go ahead and play the piano, little boy, but I'm here to tell you, you're never going to be a virtuoso. So a number of people took these pledges, and she is thinking that the people that took them could be the ones who actually start coming to embody some of these teachings rather than just have them, and they can carry this thing along. And the third thing she said she was doing, other than writing and what I just mentioned, she said she was preparing the way for the person who was going to come in 1975. Because it's the 7th century deal and she's the 6th century. It's the last 25 years of each century. So she said she was preparing the way for the ones coming in the next century. Who she said will be greater than I. Now the ideal was, her ideal was to have this group called the Theosophical Society with a bunch of people active in it. And some people who are carrying kind of the inner side of it down through time. So that when this person appears in the 20th century, in 1975, there'll be a whole apparatus set up that they can use. And there'll be people who have retained some of this who will be there. And there'll be all these writings that have had 100 years to get read by very few people, but very relevant people. Einstein being that example I gave. Well, very little of that panned out. Within months of starting that esoteric section, quite a number of the people had rendered themselves no longer eligible because stuff came up that they couldn't deal with and they flipped out behind it, or they went and raped somebody, or just weird stuff. Because we don't have a clue what's inside of us. And the whole deal, you have to, whatever it is, you have to learn how to master it. That's why I talk about masters. Mastered it. So she is also laying the framework. But as it happened in 1975, there was a Theosophical Society still all over the world, in Ojai, Adyar, India, Madras. There around, there are a bunch of theosophical societies around. They still have the same objects. They have all of her writings. And some of the people know her writings cold, And so the person in 1975 checked these places out, and I said, it's not happening here. They got the buildings, they got the grounds, they got the incredible libraries. They don't have anybody in touch with masters here. It's a, quote, dead unit. So there's nothing for this person to use. But the language is there, and the books were in print, so that could be utilized. But the actual attempt by Blavatsky to form a nucleus, this is her phrase, a nucleus of universal brotherhood, it failed. Because most people, especially those who got involved in the esoteric section, most people got fascinated by phenomena, various kinds of psychic phenomena, all of which have been known about forever. But you have to, unless you're a natural, you don't know about them. But these people were studying things that would make them more conscious of such things. And people just got mesmerized by psychic phenomena. And they forgot all about what she called the first object, which is working for brotherhood of humanity. So as she was leaving, she knew when she was done because she completed those 3 things I just mentioned. She was 60 years old. She'd been in ill health for probably the last 20. Sometimes barely able to even function, and yet she kept writing 8 hours a day. And by 1891, she'd completed everything she was supposed to write had gotten written. Everything she was supposed to set up had gotten set up. And she was done. So she left. And almost immediately, and she said while still alive, she said, I will have no successors. I don't have any successors. So when I die, if someone stands up and says, "Now Blavatsky passed it on to me," they're lying to you. I don't have any successors, she said. Within a year of her death, there were 3 people competing for having been the chosen successor, and those 3 spawned little mini pseudo-theosophical societies, and the whole thing just started splitting up, and it's still splitting up. It split up into something called the New Age. That's what it split up into. And most of the New Age isn't new, and most of the New Age is definitely a very low level and at worst gray magic. So it's got nothing to do with pure light or wisdom. So what could have been a beacon shattered and turned into what we've got. And there were people who stayed true to it. But not many. Yeah. She talked about magic, and she said magic is nothing but the mastery and control over the hidden forces of nature. Like we decided we want to get up and walk out the door, we walk out the door. That's mastery and control of the body, at least to that degree. Well, one can get mastery and control over the mind, over the emotions, and over more subtle things that we only sense. And she had all that. And, she was a bit of a character, though. She said the requirements for studying under a true teacher, even after you've taken these pledges, if you do, she said, the requirements are very strict. So if you're kind of a laissez-faire kind of person, oh yeah, I could see that, man. Best stay in Ojai, or Sonoma, because it's not only difficult, but it takes everything one has. says Blavatsky. It's pretty much got to be the only thing you're up to. That doesn't mean you don't have a job, and you don't do this, you don't do that, but in those things, that's what you're up to. In other words, what you're up to never changes. Although where you're up to it does, you know. Work, school, home, movie, getting gas. There's no divisions. You know, as she said, there is no non-spiritual life. So that's why when a person comes to begin seeing what it is, they don't see anything different from what they've seen all along. They just see it in a different light. Yeah.
She using meditation, is that to help a lot of this come about?
No, she didn't use meditation at all. She didn't need to. She was just there. Wherever meditation takes you, that's where she was all the time. So no, she didn't meditate. Her books, though, like the Secret Doctrine, I mean, you don't have to be interested in reading one word of it, but you might be interested in just going to a library and like finding a copy of it. Just pick up a copy of it. It's a big, thick book about like this. And, you know, just thumb through it, you know. All these little, teeny little, you know, letters, diagrams, symbols, you know, words that you can have no idea what they mean in all caps, and hundreds of pages of that, and hundreds of footnotes. You know, just check it out visually is all I'm saying. And then think of the following. When she was writing that book, and there were people around her, helping her. You know, when she was writing that book, she was sitting in a bare room with a chair and a desk and paper and some pencils. And she wrote that entire book in that room with nothing else in the room. There are thousands of references in that book to really obscure things that may only exist in 2 libraries in the world somewhere. There's all these references in that book, like to things like that. They've all been checked. They're all correct. And she wrote that whole thing in a bare room. And when asked about it by the people who are noticing, you seem to not have any reference books here. She said, yes, I just put myself into a certain state and I just see the pages and write them down. And in the very beginning of that book, The Secret Doctrine, there's a phrase, she says, the author, it's a preface, the author, and then there's a comma. The author, comma, the writer, rather, comma. So she saw herself as the writer, not the author of The Secret Doctrine. But she was a good writer, because the author could just put it on the astral plane, and she could just read it off there and write it down, copy it down. So that's how she wrote that book, she said. Which means she didn't write it, but somebody had to get it down onto the physical plane on a piece of paper.
Is there a name for who the author was?
They apparently had more than one author.
Not named.
They're named.
Like Roku,
No, they're named, but I don't want to name them because she didn't want to name them. And before she died, she was the one that after all the developments since the 14th century to the 19th, by the 19th it was time to actually say publicly that Mahatmas exist in human form. And by the end of her life, she said that she was sorry she'd ever brought that up because people couldn't get it and they're asking the wrong questions and they just couldn't really sense the sacredness of it. And they gave them tests, you know. Well, if you're really what you claim you are, then one guy said, then have tomorrow morning's edition of the London Times appear in India before it appears in England. Stuff like that. And then when they wouldn't do it, the people asking the question would of course assume that they wouldn't do it because they couldn't do it. Therefore they're frauds too. As she said, slander will be what gets us. There won't be burning anymore. Slander. Yeah. So she left, having completed what she had to complete, and she is glad to leave because she is so ill for so long. She apparently almost died in the late 1880s, and this is another one of these things where she is given a conscious choice. You've done enough. You can leave. She was told, and she said, "I haven't written the Secret Doctrine yet." And she was told, "That's all right. You've done enough. You can leave." She said, "No, I'm going to stay until that book's done," and she did. But she was extremely ill the whole time. And then the second to last book she wrote in her life was called "The Voice of the Silence," which is worth checking out if you're interested in things related to what she called the esoteric section. The Voice of the Silence, it's online, and it's supposedly a translation of some much more ancient texts, much longer, which is some fragments out of some ancient texts. They're pretty amazing. And its dedication is to the few. And then the very last book she wrote was called The Key to Theosophy. And it's all about the main teaching, the main categories of the theosophical position, and a chapter on each category, so to speak, and it's all in question-answer format. And it's real easy to read, as opposed to the Secret Doctrine. So if you ever want to say, what's Blavatsky's trip about? What's her worldview? What's she teaching? Go read The Key to Theosophy. That's the best starting point. She talks about all the origin of man, origin of the cosmos, karma, reincarnation, the higher mind, the lower mind, the illusory nature of the physical field. It covers it all, but in real readable language. So it's not a bad place to check out. And I just want to close by reading something that this man Judge wrote about her after she died. The man that she asked to be brought to that farm. And please bring this guy with you next time, who I've never met. So she dies in August 8th of 1891. So she was 60. This man says after her death, he's called her most faithful disciple and truest friend. He writes, "Her aim was to elevate the race. Her method was to deal with the mind of the century as she found it, by trying to lead it on step by step, to seek out and educate a few who, appreciating the majesty of the secret science and devoted to the great orphan humanity, could carry on her work with zeal and wisdom, to found a society whose efforts, however small itself might be, would inject into the thought of the day the ideas, doctrines, nomenclature of the wisdom religion, so that when the next century shall have seen its 75th year, the new messenger coming again into the world would find this society still at work, the ideas sown broadcast, the nomenclature ready to give expression and body to the immutable truth, and thus to make easy the task which for her, since 1875 was so difficult and so encompassed with obstacles in the very paucity of language, obstacles harder than all else to work against. So she was just part of this movement. She calls the Theosophical movement. She says it's universal. It includes every world religion. The great teachers in every world religion. Science. It's just a much broader picture of what's going on than we would normally have. And it's a universal picture. So if you read enough Shakespeare, you get the same picture. It's a universal picture. And you can kind of start recognizing the characters and stuff. So next week we'll be talking about drawing the larger circle, which is kind of goes, we won't be talking about a person next week, but more like a set of ideas. But the main idea is the circle's too small. Got to start drawing larger ones. We have teeny little circles, like our neighborhood and their neighborhood, you know, two little circles, you know. It just goes from there. Our country, your country. My money, your money. All these little circles protecting themselves. Yeah, and then they hang around with other similar circles, and you got a whole bunch of little similar circles protecting their big circle, you know, called Christianity, or evolutionism, you know, or Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah, yeah. So, drawing the larger circle, we'll talk about next week. And the amazing thing about Blavatsky, we didn't have time to go into it, but it's how many people she influenced. And it's all been documented, and it hasn't all been science, artists, musicians. You know, quite an influence. And even the hardcore women's libists give her credit with starting the women's movement, because she was absolutely, women and men are absolutely equal from her standpoint. We're talking about souls, we're not talking about what form you're in. You know, so she just bashed all that male chauvinism to pieces, you know, like, get a clue, guys. You know, so she was slandered, but she didn't care. She knew it was coming. It's like, it's just part of the deal. Yeah.
How old was she when she met Blavatsky, and what sort of a relationship did they have?
Well, she was very young, maybe 19, when she married this Blavatsky man, and they had no relationship whatsoever.
Well, did he support her, though, financially?
No, she had money from her family.
Why would one marry?
No one's been able to figure that one out. I mean, she did it for some reason, and nothing happened, nothing got consummated, and then she walked away and started this incredible life. So, no, I mean, there's all kinds of speculation about why, but she never actually said why, so it just remains speculation. Yeah.
Do you have the list of the 7 pledges?
No, I don't, but they're online.
Are they
Uh-huh. Yeah, if you look up something called preliminary memorandum, you'll find them. They're all pretty knowable, and a lot of them have to do with taking on certain aspects of oneself. And,
Who was
Annie Besant was a woman that started working with Blavatsky in England, who became her closest pupil toward the end. And she'd been a very politically active woman before she met Blavatsky, and then she met Blavatsky and somehow knew that she was supposed to help this woman, so she helped her, including when she was writing the Secret Doctrine and other things. And she's one of the ones that claimed to be a successor of Blavatsky, which she wasn't. But she did go on to write a number of books herself and become very involved in the very beginning of things like giving women the right to vote and stuff like that. She was much more politically involved and did a lot of good work, kind of pioneering work in different fields of, that would help people like women, you know, get a better deal out of this thing, and also children. You know, we still have children working for us, not you and me, but people who own the products we buy. Any other comments before we edge out of here? Scott?
You mentioned seven levels of reality that she used to refer to or acknowledge in Buddhist parallel to Hindu 7 levels.
Yes. Yeah, they're just different. Every single tradition, every single spiritual tradition, including Christianity, in its beginning, they talk about these 7 levels, and they tend to give them different names, but the reality is the same, because reality doesn't change from one age to another or one teacher to another. So yeah, same 7 levels. They're only right. A couple more hands up. Yeah.
Was there any way to know if people were awakening or what was happening as the students? First of all, what was happening to their consciousness, and second, what broke it all up when she died?
Well, what was happening in their consciousness? Too general a question to answer. And what broke it all up when she died was people hadn't gone deep enough. They hadn't gone deep enough. So when she was no longer there as the kind of force holding it all together, suddenly that's gone, and no one else has developed that kind of centeredness that could keep the thing going. So it just fell apart. Because they were all just basically hanging on, whereas they should have been building their own strength. And it didn't happen. Yeah.
That's like the eddy farm with like eddy currents in the water, like little eddies.
Kind of, but it was literally the name of the farm. But it became famous because all these phenomena were occurring there. I just want to give you two, and this has little to do with anything, but just 2 minor incidents from her life. I mean, she was a very eccentric woman. She, as I said, she cared nothing for customs. And so at one point she has this guy putting things in envelopes for her in another room. And people volunteer to do stuff, needs to be done. She can't be doing that. She's writing these damn books. But stuff has to, allocation of tasks. So this guy doing envelopes in the other room and putting stamps on them. And she's taking a break from her reading, and she kind of writing, and she kind of cruises in there and looks down at a letter he's got on the desk. He's putting a stamp on it. The stamp isn't square. And it's, kind of twisted. And she looks at him and says, thank you for putting the stamps on the letters for me, but please do know that you'll never be an occultist in this life. You'll never be an occultist in this life. But you're welcome to study and do but it's not going to happen for you this time. Just by looking at the way he put a stamp on the envelope. It's more than a lack of attention, but that's part of it. And the other little ditty is, this happened real early. She was writing her first big book, which is called Isis Unveiled, which is, if you're interested in science or religion, check it out. It's an incredible book. But anyway, she's writing this book, Isis Unveiled, and she's writing with pencil. So this guy would periodically, bring some sharpened pencils into her and put them on her desk for her. She'd be writing away. And this guy was doing something in the other room. He's editing or something. She'd write it, then he'd edit it or something for grammar and spelling and stuff. So at one point he's bringing a editing thing back to her that he's done. And he puts his pencil down on her desk while he's showing her the pages. And then she says, "Well, thank you very much." And he's ready to take the pages wherever they go after that. And he's put his pencil down on her desk. And as he's about to reach for his pencil, she picks it up and starts writing with it. And she's got 4 or 5 pencils sitting right beside her. But she picks up the one he set down and starts writing with it. And he gets angry at her. He said, I really don't mind helping you, but I wish you'd quit stealing my pencils. And this is a flat desk, flat wood desk. So she starts moving her hand back and forth on top of the desk like this. And after about 4 of those, 6 pencils appear. And she hands them to him and says, here's some more pencils for you. And that's the kind of phenomena that she said was low level, and she discouraged its cultivation. But she could do stuff like that if she wanted to. She just didn't do it. as child's play. You know, the Brotherhood of Humanity was a bit more important. Yeah. So Christ was apparently sorry that he, excuse me, sorry that he performed miracles. So they say in the esoteric Christianity. He was sorry he performed miracles, and Blavatsky was sorry she'd mentioned the Mahatmas, even though she had been told to the time's right. It's the sixth thing since the 14th century. Let's at least put the name out there, or the concept out there. Fully enlightened human beings in human form right now exist, and if you want to learn something, you can ask them, and you can do it inside your head. And so that was put out there. Now that's the first time that had been put out there since the 3rd century AD. So we're talking 1,600 years that idea hadn't been put out there in the West, because the West wasn't ready for it yet. It knocked it out in the 3rd century AD. It had been there before for a couple thousand years, but the early church wiped that idea out, and because it was all about Jesus, who was actually just one of these guys. But that's not about the last thing the church wanted to hear. So suddenly, 1,600 years later, this idea is getting introduced again. They're fully enlightened beings, and they exist, and they have a lot to do with what's going on in the world, and you can help them if you want to. And she was sorry she'd mentioned it, which is kind of sad. But she did what she came to do, and she's been called one of the most amazing women in human history, actually. Just the sheer volume of what she wrote is almost unbelievable. And her impact is still occurring, but not directly. But basically, if you want to know about her, read something she wrote. Like the teachers say, if you want to know us, study our philosophy. So that's the best way to get to know her, study her philosophy. And then they also said, if you want to serve us, serve our humanity. So the teachers are kind of, your relationship to them is through studying what they taught and through serving humanity. There's no need for like a direct connection with one of them. Yeah. If you study what they write and try to serve humanity, you may or may not one day meet one of them. Maybe in a dream. It doesn't have to be face to face. So I'll end with this strange little thing that has nothing to do with our talk. I had a friend years ago at Ventura College who most of the college regarded as quite mad. And he did have to get carried from the lawn in front of the college library to a psych ward one day. So he did have a few problems, but like most people with that kind of problems, I hit it off with him real well. And I recognized where he was, and having been there myself, it's kind of a trippy place to be. Like carrying a neutron bomb around in your pocket, stuff like that. He'd kind of whisper that to me. Got a neutron bomb in my pocket. Cool. But in the course of over several years, he took my classes, and then he'd come in and sit in once in a while. He'd disappear for a year, and suddenly he'd be there for a day. And he'd always been through a lot in between. And he turned me on to some stuff that I needed to be turned on to when he turned me on to it. And I don't think he knew he was doing it, but he might have. Like he gave me a really complicated formula one day and told me this had to do with unified field theory, which science is supposedly still working on. He gives me this formula. He said it only took me 7 years. And I still have it. This is like 15 years later. And I still haven't figured it out. I figured parts of it out. Anyway, I figure, I retire. I haven't seen him in a couple of years at that point. So I figure I'll probably never see him again. One of the more interesting people I've met, that's for sure. And interested in all this philosophical stuff, for sure. And so I figure I'll never see him again, But once in a while he'd come to mind, it'd be cool to run into Joe again, But it never happened. God, I don't even know where the hell he is. So I'm sitting out here before the talk in front of the beauty salon where they take care of your appearance. And I'm sitting there, just kind of doing a people watcher thing while waiting for this event. And I look up and Joe's walking up the sidewalk. And I say hi and he says hi and then he suddenly recognizes me. He said, "Come back." I said, "Yeah, Joe." He said, "I thought I'd never see you again." I said, "I thought I'd never see you again." And here you are walking up the damn sidewalk. I said, "Where were you headed?" "Nowhere." He didn't know about the talk, he nothing. So I said, "I'm giving a talk up here in half an hour, why don't you check it out, So he's here. Very happy I ran into him after all these years. And I ascertained that he's kind of living in Ventura, so there'll be a possibility of occasional contact outside of these lectures. Because he may still have a lot to teach me, I don't know. He has in the past. And, but they came and got him at Ventura College when he was out playing badminton in front of the college library with his badminton rack. Very actively involved in the game, and there was no shuttlecock and no other player. So that was a bit much for the uptight administrators at Ventura College. Yeah. Who wish they were teaching at a real college. So they took it out on their students instead. But we're getting off the subject here. I don't want to reveal too many secrets about the establishment, or I'll start getting slandered too. Actually, it's already happened. They got rid of me at VC. It took them 20 years, but they finally did. And I didn't have to. They didn't even need my okay. Yeah, I went to class one day, just another day, just going to teach my class. I walk up there, there's a campus security guy outside the door, and he informs me that I do not have a class any longer and I need to go talk to the college president. So that's how my career ended. And it all had to do with slander, just like Blavatsky says. Yeah, and libel as well, because some of it was written down. And by my best friend there at the college. My best friend there at the college. So it's a trip, just being willing to talk this way. You make some enemies once in a while. At the college there, I was informed, this kid comes up to me and says, "I don't want to bother you, Mr. Kalmbach, but I was up in so-and-so's house the other day in Oakview, and she showed me this gun and she told me she was going to kill you with it. I thought maybe I should mention it to you." This woman was I think she was Jesus. She wasn't just a Jesus freak. She was really tuned in, and she knew I was Satan. And so you get these little diversions, So I had to call the sheriff and tell him there's this woman that's making these threats with a pistol. And the sheriff has to go over and tell her that's not cool. He can arrest her for just talking that way, he tells her. And I think she faded into the woodwork. But you get this stuff, if you're going to talk about the light, you get these people who resent it, So, but she didn't care, Blavatsky. And her sense of integrity and devotion to her teachers was absolutely unshakable, which is an example of what a real pupil's like. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, it'll be less personal. Okay, thank you.